Okay, hello Year 10 and welcome to your first lesson on our new topic, which is called the living world. This topic is another physical geography topic, so it will also appear on paper 1, just like hazards, which you've just finished. And it's probably my favourite topic from the whole paper. One of the reasons is because you get to look at some really good examples of places around the world, but another reason is it's not particularly difficult. There's not huge amounts of new knowledge that you need to know, and luckily, a lot of the things that we cover are things that you will probably have done in science even as far back as year 6 and certainly in geography since you've been at Knights Templar. So, today's lesson is an introduction to what ecosystems are, and we're just going to look at some different examples of ecosystems and how they work and the main things that make up an ecosystem. Now, how these lessons will work is that each lesson you will have a video just like this, and they will all be up on the KTS Geography YouTube channel. And you are also going to need this particular booklet here. So, those of you that were in school right up until the point that we left should have been given one of these booklets as a paper copy. If you haven't, it's not a massive problem because the whole booklet is attached to show my homework for each homework. And you can either print out the relevant pages if you can print at home, or if you can't print at home, don't worry, you can just write out your answers on paper. You might need to do a small amount of copying out, or you can just take a little photo of the relevant section on your phone and pop that into your work if you're doing it electronically. If you haven't got one of these booklets and you can't access it for whatever reason, please do let your teacher know as soon as possible, because all of the lessons that we do for this topic are going to rely on this particular this booklet. As well as using this booklet and the videos that you're going to be given, you are still obviously going to need your textbooks as well. So you all have online access to your textbooks. And again, if you can't access the textbook and we haven't put the relevant section into this video, if it's needed, please do let your geography teacher know and they can tell you how to log into the textbook. So let's get started. So ecosystems are very simply any collection, any group of plants, animals, living things, non-living things that create a particular environment. So an ecosystem can be anything from something as small as a pond in your garden, a little wooded area, or it can be anywhere up to as large as something that we call a biome, which is a ginormous ecosystem which can cover entire countries or entire continents. So you can see this map here is a biome map, and it shows the 9 main biomes that we have. The ones that we will be looking at throughout this topic are tropical rainforests, and we are going to look at hot desert environments. So we're going to be looking at the darker green, and we're also going to be looking at the yellowy areas as well. We're going to look at those slightly later on in the topic, but as I say, today is about ecosystems in general, and they can cover a huge range of scales, from tiny, small scale local ecosystems all the way up to global biomes. All ecosystems are made up of living and non-living things. So this is just an example of one that I believe is probably somewhere in Australia, judging by the fact there's a kangaroo there. And we call the living elements of an ecosystem the biotic components. Remember, when you do biology, it's all about living things, plants and animals, etc. So that's a good way of remembering it. The non-living things, the dead things, or things that never have been alive, are called the abiotic components. So the ones that we can see in this picture here, you've got things like rocks, you've got sunlight. Those things have never been alive. It's not like they've died, they're just not living things, so they're called abiotic components. The first thing I'd like you to do then, and this is in the booklet, is on page 10, so all of today's work is page 10. I would like you to have a read, and I'm going to read through this paragraph, and I would like you to read it and then highlight any of the most important words or the most important explanations, and you are going to use this information to do your next activity in a moment. So, an ecosystem is a unit that includes all the biotic living parts, e.g. plants and animals, and the abiotic non-living parts, e.g. soil and climate in an area. The organisms in an ecosystem can be classed as producers, consumers, or decomposers. A producer is an organism that uses sunlight energy to produce food, such as a banana tree. A consumer is an organism that gets its energy by eating other organisms, so a monkey eating a banana. A decomposer is an organism that gets its energy from eating or breaking down dead material, including dead producers, dead plants, dead consumers, other animals, or fallen leaves or bacteria and fungi that break down dead monkeys or banana peels. When dead material is decomposed, nutrients are released into the soil. The nutrients are then taken up from the soil into plants. The plants may be eaten by consumers. When the plants or consumers die, the nutrients return to the soil. This transfer of nutrients is called nutrient cycling. So I want you to have another read through that, highlight it. If you aren't able to print off the booklet, that's fine. You can just write it out onto your paper. Make sure you've highlighted the key terms. So if you need to pause this video to do that, that's absolutely fine. Because what you are going to be doing with those key terms, and you'll notice that some of the words have been put in bold, they are the most important words. You are going to use them to create a glossary. So normally we give you a lovely glossary at the start of each topic. Obviously we can't do that at the moment, so you are going to be making your own glossaries. You need to lay it out like a table. So I've even helped you out by doing the first example there for you. And you can get all of the definitions from that paragraph that we just read, or you can use your textbooks as well. Remember, they have a glossary in the back of them with the definitions. So pause this video. It should take you between 10 and 20 minutes to do this. There's about 8 or 9 words that you need to have in there, but feel free to add any other ones that you can think of. Okay, so as I mentioned, ecosystems are made up of a combination of biotic and abiotic components. So we've got some images here from different ecosystems showing you some of the key biotic and abiotic components. So hopefully you should be able to identify which of these are living or biotic and non-living abiotic. So we've got our abiotic, our non-living components, our rocks, our soils. You can see some snow in the bottom right hand picture, which shows you what the climate's like, but again, that is not living, so that's abiotic. Got mountains in the background of the other picture at the bottom. But we also have our living components, and these are probably the most important ones because without the living components, living, consuming each other, producing their own energy, we wouldn't have an ecosystem. You just have rocks and weather. So what I want you to do is I want you to take this opportunity to do a little bit of skills work. So I know a lot of the things that we've been giving you over the last few weeks have been research, putting together some case studies, for example, but it's really important to remember that your skills, your exam skills need to be ticking along as well. So what I've got here is a picture of a part of a pond ecosystem. So we're going to look at a pond ecosystem for most of today's lesson. I would like you, if you can print that picture, please do. If you can't, it's not really a problem. But what I'd like you to do is to try and annotate this picture or write down some of your observations of this picture. So what can you see in this picture? Remember, we're looking for things like the biotic living and abiotic components of this ecosystem. So what can you see? Can you hazard a guess at what some of the species that you can see might be? You should be able to come up with about 4 or 5 annotations. So pause this video, have a look at it for a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 annotations or observations of what's happening in this pond, and then I'll go through some answers with you in a minute. Okay, so some of the things that you should be able to spot from this pond ecosystem. You don't need to be David Attenborough to work out that we've got some ducks in this picture. We've got clearly some water as it's a pond. We've got some kind of plants, some pondweed perhaps. and as it's a pond, you'd hope there's probably some fish in there. So these are sorts of observations I'm looking for. So plants like reeds, they don't just grow, I'm not just saying they grow, but they grow in a particular place. They're growing around the edge of the pond, aren't they? They don't just grow right in the middle usually. On the surface we can see ducks, and there's probably some small insects such as water boatmen. So they're the tiny little kind of pond skippers that hop along the top of a pond. I'm sure you've seen them before. On the banks of the pond, we've got grasses, we've got some bushes, and there's probably some trees as well. We can't necessarily see them this zoomed in on the picture though. At the edge of the pond, the water's going to be shallow because a pond isn't a perfect kind of square where it's at the same depth all the way round. And at the centre where the water's deeper, there is probably some fish. So it's a combination of the things that you can definitely see and the things that you could imply about this pond ecosystem. One of the most important things that we need to look at within an ecosystem are how the plants and the animals, the two main biotic components, relate to each other. So hopefully what you can remember from the very first part of the lesson is that we look at something called the nutrient cycle, the way that energy is passed from animal to animal or plant to animal by basically being eaten. So when a producer, which makes its energy from the sunlight, is eaten by a bug, for example, that nutrients, that energy is passed on to the next creature by it eating the previous one. So energy is passed along the food chain by eating. And we represent that in food chains or food webs, and I'm fairly certain that you have come across these before, so I'm not going to spend particularly long on them. This is a very kind of year 6 science thing, so we'll just do a little bit of revision. And food chains are usually very simple to look at and to understand. So here is an example of a freshwater pond food chain. So we would have detritus or decaying leaves. So you know when leaves turn brown and mushy, they are decaying, they're dying basically, their nutrients are being broken down, which is perfect for midge larvae, so small insects, baby insects, and these get their energy from eating those decaying leaves. However, those midge larvae, these tiny insects, are likely to be eaten themselves by larger insects, which in turn get eaten by fish, and the fish are probably going to be then prey for birds such as the heron that we can see just next to it there. So that's nice and simple. Each thing is eaten by one other thing. Unfortunately, in real life, things aren't usually that simple. And what we usually have in our ecosystems is something that looks a little bit more like this. So this is a food web, which shows that actually most things are not eaten by just one other type of creature. They are eaten by several other types of creature, and in turn they will eat lots of different things. Imagine how boring your diet would be if you were a wolf who only ate mice or rats. Imagine if you were a human that only ate pot noodles every day. It'd be very boring, wouldn't it? And what happens if you can't get pot noodles one day? So you are going to have to eat a varied diet. You're going to have to consume your energy from various different sources, and that's exactly what happens in ecosystems. So we don't tend to get simple food chains like the one on the left. We usually get food webs, which are much more complicated to look at, but actually when you break them down and look at each animal or each plant individually, they're not too tricky. So that's exactly what I want you to have a go at doing. In your booklet on page 10, you'll notice that activity 2 is to draw a food chain or food web in the space provided, label each component, so each plant or animal, as either a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. So I have given you some examples to use here from a pond ecosystem. You need to write the name of the particular creature, then you need to have a go at drawing it. Trust me, my drawing skills are terrible, so I'm not particularly bothered about how good your drawings are. And then you need to decide if each creature is a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. So for instance, a pondweed doesn't eat anything to get its energy, it makes its own energy from the sunlight, so that is a producer. So I'd like you to start off just by drawing a simple food chain, which just means one thing is eaten by the next, and that's eaten by the next. So you need to pause this video. This should take you no more than 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will talk about the food chain in a minute. Okay, so here is an example that you might well have come up with of a simple food chain. So a food chain being just one thing is eaten by the next thing by the next thing. So a pondweed is your producer, it makes its own energy, but that energy is then transferred to the insect larva. So the insect's going to eat the pondweed to get its own energy. Insect larvae is going to then be eaten by the minnow, the small fish, and that in turn is probably going to be prey for the kingfisher. So nice and simple, pondweed's eaten by insect larvae, that's eaten by the fish is eaten by the kingfisher. But remember, food chains aren't particularly realistic in real life. Usually we have several different things eating each other thing. So as a stretch now, and any of you who are looking for grades 5, 6 above, I would like you to now try and turn your food chain into a food web by adding in other creatures. You might need to do a little bit of research or take a look in your textbooks to find some other consumers or producers that operate in a pond ecosystem and how they fit in to this food web. Now, the last thing that we need to consider this lesson is that there are a lot of things that can disrupt your food chain. A lot of things can stop each animal, each producer, each consumer being able to eat the things that they normally do to get their energy. Remember that humans are having huge impacts on ecosystems, small and large scale, and we're leading to the extinction of certain types of creatures, we're destroying habitats in other places, and that has a big impact on how energy and nutrients are moved through a food chain. A lot of the different components are so closely linked to each other that by changing just one component, one creature, it has massive knock-on effects, almost like a domino effect with the rest of the ecosystem. And as always, some creatures will benefit from this and other creatures will suffer as a result of this change. So I've got an example of a change here. Frogs are very commonly found in pond ecosystems, really important part of a pond ecosystem because they eat insects and insect larvae, but they are also eaten by storks and other large birds and other kind of woodland creatures like foxes, badgers, etc. Now imagine that a particular disease that only really affects frogs comes to this particular ecosystem and it wipes out all of the frogs in this pond. There's no frogs, there's no frog spawn, there's no tadpoles, there will be no frogs. I'd like you to have a think about how this will affect the ecosystem. How will it affect the creatures that eat the frogs or that are eaten by the frogs? Who's going to benefit and who's not going to benefit? And again, those of you who are looking for a bit of a stretch, how might this change the ecosystem in the long term as well as over the next few years? So pause this, have a think about it for a couple of minutes, and then we will take a look at how it might change the ecosystem. So the likely changes to the ecosystem as a result of the frogs dying out are going to be that the insect larvae who are normally eaten by the frogs, they're going to have a whale of a time because they are now no longer being predated or eaten or hunted by their usual predator. So they're going to be going around multiplying, not having anyone who's going to eat them or having fewer creatures that are going to eat them. So there will be more and more insect larvae. The storks and the other large birds, on the other hand, they're going to run out of food at some point, aren't they? So they're going to have to be looking at other ecosystems. They're going to have to go further afield to find their food, or they are going to have to start to eat different food that perhaps isn't as nutritious or isn't as easy for them to find. But the most likely outcome is that actually storks and other large birds will decrease in numbers because there just isn't enough food for them all to survive. So you can see this one small change has a big negative impact for some creatures, a positive impact for others, but certainly this change will affect the ecosystem for quite a long time to come. And this is just one of a number of possible changes to ecosystems. So your final activity for today, I would like you to choose one of the 3 possible changes to a pond ecosystem and I'd like you to explain how this change could affect the ecosystem as a whole. So the three that you can choose from are fertilisers from a nearby farm washing into the pond and killing the fish, a new type of fish being added to the pond which eats minnows, or pondweed being killed off by a chemical leak from a nearby factory or something like that. So you need to write this at the bottom of page 10, please, where it says question 3. And the really important thing I'd like you to do is to try and include as many words from your glossary as possible. So explaining how the changes to the producers might happen, explaining how the amount of consumers of pondweed might decrease, etc. So it's all about including your key terms, because remember, that's what the examiners will be looking for when you write your answers to these questions. This should take you no more than about 7 minutes, and after that time I want you to just take a look back at all of your notes, make sure that they're all finished, highlighted, that you're happy with them, and that is your work for today's lesson. So I will see you next lesson with another video and another set of activities. If you've got any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to email your teachers, and I will see you next lesson.